Sarah rushed through the crowded market, her heart pounding in nervous anticipation as she glanced down at her watch. She had an important interview in less than an hour, and the bus she'd hoped to catch was nowhere in sight. Her mind was preoccupied with thoughts of her future and the possibility of escaping the constant weight of financial struggles. As she pushed her way through the marketplace, her eyes caught sight of something that stopped her in her tracks. In front of a small fruit stall, an elderly woman was being verbally attacked by the vendor. The woman with silver hair neatly tied back and a simple dress stood helplessly as the fruit vendor, a burly woman with a scowl etched across her face, mocked her. "You old hag! Stop wasting my time. Do I look like a fool to you? You can't pay. So get lost." The vendor sneered, crossing her arms and glaring at the elderly woman. Sarah felt her stomach knot as she watched the scene unfold. She couldn't understand how the crowd around them just watched without lifting a finger. Some people even chuckled as though finding humor in the old woman's distress. It was a harsh reality that left a bitter taste in her mouth. As she stood there, her own financial situation weighing on her, something inside her snapped. Sarah couldn't bear to watch any longer. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her voice firm. "That's enough." She called out her words, cutting through the air. The vendor turned to glare at her, her eyes narrowing with annoyance. "Mind your own business, girl," the vendor retorted. But Sarah wasn't about to back down. "It is my business," she shot back. "You shouldn't treat an elderly woman like this. She just needs a little help." Determined, Sarah reached into her purse, pulling out the last bit of cash she had. With a steady hand, she handed the money to the vendor. "Here," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "I'll buy the fruit for her." The vendor snatched the money, shoving a small bag of apples towards the elderly woman with a dismissive grunt. Sarah turned to the woman, her anger fading into warmth. Gently, she placed the bag of fruit in the woman's frail hands. "Here, Grandma Helen." Sarah said, her voice softening. The elderly woman's eyes welled up with tears, and she touched Sarah's hand with trembling fingers. "Thank you, my dear," she whispered, her voice cracking with gratitude. Despite her own worries, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't much, but the smile on Grandma Helen's face made all the difference. The old woman shook her head, a soft smile breaking through her tears. "It's nothing," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "People don't stop to help each other like this anymore." Sarah smiled, shrugging off the praise. "It's really nothing," she replied, but deep down the warmth of the moment stayed with her. Grandma Helen looked at her with a mixture of admiration and affection, then sighed. "If only my grandson could meet a girl like you." She murmured, her words tinged with nostalgia. Sarah chuckled lightly, not understanding the weight of what Grandma Helen meant. "Why do you say that?" Sarah asked, a playful glint in her eyes. Grandma Helen smiled knowingly. "Because he needs someone with a kind heart like you," she said almost wistfully. Sarah's heart tightened at the words, though she couldn't quite place why. She felt as though, in that moment, fate had gently nudged her onto a path she hadn't expected. As she looked at her dwindling wallet, Sarah felt a pang of uncertainty. She didn't have much left, just enough to either take a taxi or buy lunch for the week. Looking at Grandma Helen, who still clutched the bag of fruit with trembling hands, something stirred within Sarah. She couldn't just leave her standing there in the middle of the busy market alone. After a moment of deliberation, Sarah took a deep breath and pulled out the remaining cash from her wallet. "Take this, Grandma," she said, her voice warm. "Use it to get a taxi home. You don't have to walk all the way back." Grandma Helen's eyes widened with concern. "Oh, my dear, no," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "You don't have much either. You shouldn't spend your money on me." But Sarah was insistent. "It's fine, really," she said with a smile, trying to ease the older woman's concerns. "I'll walk to the next bus stop. I'm in a bit of a rush for an interview, but I'll be fine. Don't worry about me." Grandma Helen studied Sarah with a soft, knowing gaze. "Are you sure you won't be late waiting for another bus?" she asked, genuine concern on her face. Sarah nodded playfully. "I promise, Grandma." If I get too rich and successful, I might forget about the little people she teased. So being a little late isn't such a bad thing. Grandma Helen chuckled, but then her expression grew serious. You're a rare kind of woman, she said. A man would be very lucky to have you. Sarah laughed lightly, dismissing the comment with a playful wave of her hand. Oh no, Grandma, she said with a smile. Don't tell me you're trying to set me up with your grandson again. Grandma Helen smirked. Well, maybe I am, she replied clearly. Amused by the idea, Sarah rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help but smile. I think I'll pass for now, she said. I barely have time for myself. Grandma Helen sighed, though she didn't press the issue further. At least give me your number, she said. That way, if I ever need help, I know you'll be there. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then smiled warmly. She pulled out a small notebook and quickly wrote down her phone number. Of course, Grandma, she said, gently placing the paper in her hands. Call me any time. With a final wave, Sarah turned and hurried off toward the bus stop, her heart a little lighter than it had been before. As Sarah walked away from the fruit stall, her mind was still swirling with the encounter. She had never been one to stand up to people, let alone step in when someone was being mistreated. But something about Grandma Helen's vulnerability had stirred her to action. Her heart was still racing from the rush of emotion. Helping the elderly woman had felt like the right thing to do, but it was more than that. It felt like fate, like the universe had aligned in that single moment, pulling her toward the old woman in a way she couldn't explain. Sarah turned her head to glance back at Grandma Helen, who was still holding the bag of fruit in her hands. Her eyes met Sarah's, and a gentle smile crept across her face. It wasn't a smile of relief, though it was something deeper, almost knowing. You are a rare one, my dear, Grandma Helen said softly, her voice filled with affection. Most people wouldn't have done what you did for a stranger. You've got a good heart. Sarah felt a wave of warmth wash over her, and a blush crept up her neck. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from people she had just met. Thank you, Grandma Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. Grandma Helen took a small step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the bag of fruit. She studied Sarah for a moment, her eyes crinkling at the edges in a way that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. You remind me of someone, she said with a soft sigh. Someone very dear to me. My grandson, Benjamin. Sarah paused mid-step, surprised by the sudden mention of a grandson. Grandma Helen seemed to be lost in thought for a moment before she continued. He's a good man, but he's a little distracted. I suppose I've been trying to get him to meet someone like you for a long time. Sarah's curiosity piqued, and she found herself pausing as she absorbed the information. Someone like me, she echoed, unsure if she had heard correctly. Grandma Helen chuckled, a sound full of wisdom and kindness. Yes, dear, someone with a kind heart. Someone who understands the importance of compassion and doesn't ask for anything in return. She looked at Sarah with an almost wistful expression. I think he needs someone like that in his life. Someone who would make him realize that there's more to life than business and power. Sarah wasn't sure what to say. The idea of meeting someone like Grandma Helen's grandson felt surreal, but there was something about the older woman's words that felt important, like a message she wasn't meant to ignore, feeling a little overwhelmed, but also strangely intrigued. Sarah smiled awkwardly. I don't know if I'm the right person, Grandma, but thank you, Grandma. Helen's eyes softened, and she reached out to pat Sarah's hand gently. You'd be surprised, my dear. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways, and people find each other when they least expect it. The words hung in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but feel like this encounter was more than just a chance meeting. Maybe this was a connection that was meant to happen, one that would lead her to something she had never anticipated. After a moment of silence, Grandma Helen's expression grew more serious, though still kind. You know, dear, I don't have many people in my life that I trust to help me when I need it, but you, I can tell, are different. Sarah felt a sudden warmth spread through her chest. She had always been a little closed off, unsure about trusting others. But there was something in Grandma Helen's eyes that made her feel like she could be trusted too. If you ever need anything. Grandma, don't hesitate to call Sarah, said softly. I may not have much, but I'll do what I can to help Grandma. Helen smiled, her eyes glistening with something between relief and gratitude. That means more to me than you know, Sarah. And when you see my grandson, tell him I said to give a kind heart a chance. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, scribbling something down before handing it to Sarah. This is my number. Grandma Helen said, in case you ever need me, and if you do see Benjamin, maybe pass it along to him too. Maybe he needs someone to remind him what truly matters. Sarah took the small slip of paper, her fingers brushing against Grandma Helen's worn hand. There was something about the older woman's presence that made her feel grounded and whole, something that Sarah couldn't explain but wanted to hold on to. As she slipped the paper into her bag, Sarah smiled at Grandma Helen. I'll make sure he gets it, Grandma. The old woman's smile widened, and Sarah could see the quiet joy in her eyes. Thank you, dear. I'm not asking for miracles, but sometimes all it takes is a little nudge from someone who cares. Before Sarah turned to leave, Grandma Helen gave her one last warm look. You take care of yourself, Sarah, and don't forget, sometimes fate has a funny way of bringing people together when they least expect it. Sarah gave her a final wave and began walking toward the bus stop, the weight of the conversation lingering in her mind. Was it fate or just coincidence? Either way, there was something about Grandma Helen's words that stayed with her like a puzzle piece she hadn't quite figured out yet, but was willing to discover the feeling of connection, however unexpected, was something she wouldn't soon forget. As Sarah walked away, the noise of the market faded into the background, and she found herself thinking about the possibility that just maybe her life was about to change in ways she never saw coming. The next few days passed in a blur for Sarah. She couldn't stop thinking about Grandma Helen and the brief yet meaningful encounter they had shared at the market. It wasn't often that Sarah felt connected to someone, especially a stranger, but there was something about Grandma Helen that felt different. Perhaps it was the warmth in her eyes, or the way she spoke about her grandson Benjamin. That mention had stuck with Sarah like a lingering thought she couldn't shake. Grandma Helen had been kind, wise, and full of life, despite her years, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder about her life. It wasn't until Sarah's phone rang one evening that she had another opportunity to connect with Grandma Helen. Sarah had been sitting at her small kitchen table, a half-empty cup of tea in front of her as she scrolled through job listings on her phone. The day had been a tiring one, filled with disappointment after missing her interview and facing another long stretch of financial uncertainty. But as the phone buzzed in her hand, Sarah's thoughts were interrupted. She glanced at the screen to see a familiar number. It was Grandma Helen. Hello, Sarah answered, her voice slightly surprised but warm. On the other end, Grandma Helen's cheerful voice rang through just as it had at the market. Sarah, my dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you, Grandma Helen said. I wanted to thank you again for your kindness the other day. It meant more than you could know. Sarah smiled softly, sitting up straighter in her chair. Not at all. Grandma, I'm just glad I could help. Grandma Helen paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone seemed to carry a more serious, almost conspiratorial edge. I hope you don't mind me asking, but would you be able to come visit me sometime soon? I'd love to have you over for a cup of tea and a chat. The invitation caught Sarah off guard. She hesitated briefly, glancing around her modest apartment. Of course I'd love to, Sarah said, her voice filled with surprise. When would be a good time? Grandma Helen's laugh danced through the line, and she gave Sarah the details, inviting her to a time just a few days away. I'll send the address, my dear. It's not too far from where you are, just a little out of the way, with the plan set. Sarah ended the call, her heart racing with curiosity. As the days passed, Sarah found herself both excited and anxious about the visit. She had no idea what to expect. All she knew was that Grandma Helen had mentioned her grandson in passing, and she wondered about him more with each passing moment. The idea of meeting him stirred something in Sarah, though she didn't quite know why. There was something about the way Grandma Helen had spoken of him, as if she held an unspoken hope that he would meet someone like Sarah. But who was he? And why was Grandma Helen so adamant about him meeting a woman with a kind heart like hers? Finally, the day of the visit arrived. Sarah took extra care with her appearance, though she didn't have much to dress up in. She chose a simple but neat outfit, hoping it would be enough. As she made her way to the address Grandma Helen had sent, she couldn't help but feel like she was walking into an unknown world. The area felt different, more upscale, quieter, and far from the bustling market where she had met Grandma Helen. As she turned onto the street, she was stunned to see a grand mansion standing at the end of a long, winding driveway. It was the kind of place Sarah had only ever seen in movies, massive, elegant, with iron gates and pristine landscaping. She stood at the gates for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The house looked as though it had been there for centuries, with ivy creeping up the sides and windows that seemed to hold countless stories within them. When the gates slowly swung open, a polite guard nodded at her, ushering her inside. As she walked along the path leading to the front door, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. It felt like entering a different world, one she had never imagined herself stepping into. As she reached the door, it swung open almost immediately, and Grandma Helen greeted her with open arms, her smile as warm and inviting as ever. "Welcome, my dear. I'm so glad you could make it," she said. Her voice filled with genuine happiness. Sarah smiled nervously, stepping inside. The interior of the mansion was just as grand as the exterior, with high ceilings, ornate furniture, and paintings that seemed to watch her every move. It was like stepping into a palace, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed by the opulence. Grandma Helen guided her into a cozy sitting room away from the grandness of the main hall. The room was filled with bookshelves, comfortable chairs, and a small table where they sat for tea. As they settled in, Sarah couldn't help but ask Grandma Helen, "This house? It's beautiful. I never would have expected you to live here. How long have you been here?" Grandma Helen chuckled softly, taking a sip of her tea before responding, "Oh, my dear, I've been here for quite some time now. This house has seen many years and many stories, but it's where I've found peace, and I'd like to think it's where some of my family has found their way back to as well." At the mention of family, Sarah felt a sense of curiosity rise in her. She couldn't help but ask again, "Your grandson, Benjamin, what is he like? I keep thinking about what you said when we first met, that he needs someone with a kind heart like mine. What did you mean by that?" Grandma Helen looked at her for a moment, her eyes softening. "Benjamin," she began slowly, "is a man who has been consumed by duty by his work. He's very good at what he does, but sometimes I think he forgets what really matters. He spent so much time searching for something, for someone, that he hasn't realized what's right in front of him." Sarah listened intently, her heart strangely heavy with the words Grandma Helen spoke. "And you think I could help him find that?" she asked, unsure of why she felt so deeply connected to the idea. Grandma Helen smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I think you could, my dear. But more than that, I think he needs someone who doesn't see him for his wealth or his position. Someone who sees him for who he really is. You're the kind of person who can remind him of that." Sarah felt a strange sense of warmth at Grandma Helen's words. It was as if a door had opened inside her, one she hadn't even known was there. The conversation shifted to other topics, but in the back of Sarah's mind, she couldn't stop thinking about Benjamin, the grandson who Grandma Helen hoped would meet someone like her. It was a strange thought, one that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. Sarah had never been someone who believed in fate, but as she sat in that grand mansion surrounded by the comforting presence of Grandma Helen, she couldn't help but wonder if the universe had indeed brought them together for a reason. Sarah had barely gotten settled into Grandma Helen's cozy sitting room when the soft chime of the front doorbell interrupted their conversation. Grandma Helen's face lit up with a smile as she set her teacup down gently. "Ah, there he is," she said, her voice filled with warmth and a trace of mischief. "My grandson Jack has finally arrived." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name. She had heard so much about him, and yet she couldn't help but feel nervous at the thought of meeting the man Grandma Helen had spoken so fondly of. She had imagined him to be someone kind, warm perhaps, as approachable as his grandmother. But what if he wasn't? The door to the sitting room opened, and a tall man entered his presence, commanding the room instantly. He was dressed in a sharp-tailored suit that made him appear every bit the powerful businessman Grandma Helen had hinted at. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his sharp jawline gave him an almost intimidating presence. Sarah stood up, feeling suddenly small in the face of this new person who seemed to radiate confidence and control. His eyes, a piercing blue, met hers with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Jack, this is Sarah, Grandma," Helen said, her voice filled with pride. "The young woman I've been telling you about." Jack looked at Sarah briefly before giving a nod, his expression unreadable. "It's a pleasure," he said, his voice low and smooth, but his words felt distant. He didn't offer a smile, nor did he seem particularly interested in making small talk. Sarah, caught off guard by his coldness, offered a polite smile in return. "It's nice to meet you, Jack," she said softly, though she couldn't help but feel a little awkward under his intense gaze. Grandma Helen, noticing the slight tension between them, smiled gently, as if understanding the unspoken thoughts in the room. "Sarah here was kind enough to help me out at the market the other day," she said, looking at Jack with a twinkle in her eye. "I've never met someone as selfless as her. You could learn a lot from her." "Jack." Jack's expression didn't change as he listened, but Sarah could see the faintest flicker of interest in his eyes. He nodded once, acknowledging her act of kindness, but didn't say much more. It was clear that his focus was elsewhere, his mind likely preoccupied with business or other matters that felt far more important to him than the casual conversation at hand. Grandma Helen, however, wasn't deterred by Jack's cool demeanor. "You know, Jack," she continued, her tone playfully conspiratorial, "I've been trying to get you to meet someone like Sarah for a long time. She's the kind of woman who doesn't care about your wealth or status. She just cares about people, Jack. And I think you need someone like her in your life." Sarah felt a slight heat rise to her cheeks at the mention of her name in such a glowing context. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change someone's life, but there was something about the way Grandma Helen spoke about her that made Sarah's heart swell with both pride and humility. Jack glanced at his grandmother, his expression still unreadable. "I'm not interested in any kind of setup, Grandma," he said with a small sigh, as if this conversation was one he had endured many times before. "I have a lot on my plate right now, and I'm not in the market for any kind of distraction." His words were clear and direct, but there was an underlying bitterness to them that Sarah couldn't ignore. It was as if Jack had shut himself off from anything that might require emotional investment, his focus solely on the responsibilities that weighed heavily on him. Sarah wondered if this was the result of years of pressure and success, or something deeper that he had yet to share. Despite his resistance, Grandma Helen wasn't easily discouraged. "Oh, Jack," she said with a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You're always so focused on business, so determined to find the next big deal. But sometimes life is about more than just work. It's about connection, about seeing the people around you and understanding their worth, not just their potential value. Sarah here has the kind of heart that you don't come across every day, and I believe that you of all people need to recognize that." Sarah could feel the weight of Grandma Helen's words settling around her, and for a moment she wondered if she had stepped into a situation far more complicated than she had anticipated. She had come to visit out of politeness, unsure of what to expect from both Grandma Helen and her grandson. But now the quiet tension in the room made her question whether she was part of something more significant than just a casual encounter. She didn't know Jack, not really, but there was something about his demeanor, his coldness, his detachment that drew her in, made her want to understand him better. Jack didn't respond immediately. He stood still, his gaze shifting from Grandma Helen to Sarah and back again. The silence between them felt heavy, and Sarah wondered if she should say something, if she should break the tension that had taken over the room. But before she could speak, Jack finally exhaled his shoulders, relaxing just a little. "I appreciate your concern, Grandma." he said, his voice softer than before, though still laced with a hint of reluctance. But I'm not ready for that kind of change. I have too many things to focus on right now. Grandma Helen's face softened, her smile, not faltering. I understand, my dear, she said gently. But remember, life has a way of giving you what you need when you least expect it. You just have to be open to it. She turned to Sarah, her eyes warm with encouragement. I hope you don't take his coldness personally. Sarah, Grandma, Helen said, her voice kind and understanding. He's a good man at heart. He just needs to learn to open up again. Sarah nodded, a small smile on her face, though she couldn't shake the sense of intrigue that had settled inside her. What was Jack really like beneath the surface? Why was he so distant, so unwilling to allow anyone in? She couldn't help but feel like there was more to him than he was letting on, and maybe Grandma Helen was right. Maybe he needed someone with a kind heart to help him see the world in a different light. But that was something only time would tell. For now, all Sarah could do was wait and see if fate would bring them together in a way that neither of them expected. The days following Sarah's visit to Grandma Helen's mansion passed in a haze of uncertainty. Sarah found herself reflecting often on her brief encounter with Jack, Grandma Helen's grandson, the man who had in a few fleeting moments intrigued her and yet also left her feeling like a stranger in his world. Jack had been distant, his demeanor cold, and despite Grandma Helen's attempts to connect them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something unresolved within him. It wasn't just his business-like manner, it was the way his eyes, though sharp and perceptive, seemed to carry a weight of sorrow like a man burdened by a past he couldn't let go of. A week passed, and as Sarah sat in her small apartment, preparing for another long day at work, her phone rang. It was Grandma Helen again. Sarah smiled as she answered the call, already knowing what the older woman would say. Sarah, my dear. I hope I'm not interrupting. Grandma Helen's familiar, cheerful voice came through the phone. I've been thinking about you and Jack. How did your visit go? Sarah paused, glancing out the window at the cloudy sky. It went well. Grandma Helen? She replied, not entirely sure how to explain the odd tension she felt. But Jack, he was distant. I didn't feel like we really connected. There was a soft chuckle on the other end of the line. Oh, Sarah, I know him better than anyone. He can be a hard nut to crack, but I think you made an impression on him. He's not the type to show much emotion, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Sarah's heart sank a little at those words. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Jack had felt something similar, but she knew better than to chase after someone who wasn't open to it. I understand, she said softly, but I'm not sure what I can do to change how he feels. Grandma Helen's voice grew more serious, filled with a quiet intensity. Sarah, you have something he needs. He's been through so much, and he's still fixated on someone from his past. Emily, I believe her name was. She's the reason he's shut himself off from everything else. I've been trying to get him to see that he's ready to move on, but he's not ready to let go of her. And it breaks my heart because I see how good you could be for him. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of Emily. She had wondered who this woman was, the one Jack had never spoken about, but whose shadow seemed to linger over every conversation they had. Grandma, I don't know if I can be the person to change that. Sarah said, her voice tinged with doubt. What if he's never ready to let her go? There was a long pause before Grandma Helen spoke again, her voice quieter but firm. You're not trying to erase Emily from his heart. Sarah, you're simply offering him something different. You're offering him a chance to heal, to see that love isn't just a memory. It's something that can grow, that can change. But he has to be willing to open himself to it. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, taking in Grandma Helen's words. The idea of being the one to help Jack move on from a past love seemed daunting, but at the same time she couldn't ignore the small spark of hope that flickered inside her. Could she really be the one to help him find a new beginning? The following week, Sarah ran into Grandma Helen again, this time at a cafe near the mansion. They sat in a quiet corner, the soft hum of the coffee shop providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Grandma Helen ever. The matchmaker continued to press the idea of Sarah and Jack. "I've been thinking more about what you said," Sarah said hesitantly, stirring her coffee. "I don't want to force anything, especially if Jack isn't ready. I don't want to be someone's second choice." Grandma Helen reached across the table, placing her hand over Sarah's in a gesture of comfort. "Sarah, my dear, I've seen Jack go through so much. He's not ready to let go of Emily, but he's not living either. He's in limbo. And that's why I believe you two would be good for each other. You're not asking him to forget. You're asking him to live again." Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of Grandma Helen's words. It was clear that the older woman saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. Maybe it was her kindness, her capacity to care that could be the key to reaching Jack. But how could she possibly break through the walls Jack had built around himself? "I don't know how to get through to him," Sarah admitted, her voice soft. "He's so focused on his past that I don't think he even sees me." Grandma Helen's smile was knowing, full of both patience and determination. "You're doing the right thing by not pushing him, but you also have to show him that you're here, that you care, that there's more to life than the ghosts of the past. It's not about rushing him, Sarah. It's about showing him that he's worth the effort." Over the next few days, Sarah thought about what Grandma Helen had said. She thought about Jack, his distant gaze, the way he seemed so entrenched in his work, as if his life was just a series of tasks and deadlines. She thought about his unwillingness to let go of Emily and how that seemed to consume him. And as much as she wanted to help him, Sarah also realized that she couldn't fix everything for him. She could only offer him her support, her friendship, and maybe a chance for something more. A few days later, Grandma Helen called again, her tone more excited than before. "Sarah, my dear, Jack is coming over to visit me this afternoon. I'd like you to meet him again. I think he's finally ready to listen." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the invitation. Was this the moment? Would Jack finally be willing to see her, not as a shadow of the past, but as someone who could help him move forward? "I'll be there," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. When Sarah arrived at Grandma Helen's house, she found Jack waiting in the sitting room. This time his demeanor was slightly softer, though still guarded. Grandma Helen, sensing the tension, wasted no time in breaking the ice. "Jack," she said with a knowing smile, "Sarah and I have had some wonderful talks, and I think it's time you two had one as well." Jack looked at Sarah, his eyes still a bit distant, but there was something different in his gaze, an openness, a willingness to engage. "I've been thinking about what you said," Grandma Jack said quietly, his voice low. "Maybe it's time I started living again." The moment felt like a turning point. Jack was finally acknowledging the truth. Grandma Helen had been trying to get him to see he wasn't ready to completely let go of Emily, but he was starting to see that there could be room for something else in his life. And Sarah, though still unsure of where this path would lead, felt a small sense of hope stir within her. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new for both of them. Life at home had always been a struggle for Sarah, but it was only after her visit to Grandma Helen's mansion that she realized just how much she longed to break free from the suffocating grip of her family's expectations. She had spent years trying to live up to her mother's impossible demands, all while dealing with the aftermath of her father's death. Her mother, Cynthia, had always been a source of constant pressure, her sharp words and even sharper criticisms cutting through Sarah's spirit like a knife. It wasn't that Cynthia didn't love her daughter. No, it was that her love was often twisted, conditional, and laced with manipulation. Each day felt like an uphill battle. Sarah had always been the one to pick up the pieces after her mother's outbursts, to take on the responsibilities of a household that seemed to have fallen apart after her father's death. Her brother Andrew was no help at all. He had always been irresponsible, a gambler who frittered away every penny he had. But somehow it was Sarah who bore the brunt of the financial burden. As much as she tried to escape the role she had been forced into, it felt like the walls of her reality were closing in tighter and tighter. One evening, as Sarah returned home from another long day of work, she was met with the all-too-familiar sound of her mother's voice. Cynthia was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes narrowed with an expression Sarah knew too well, one that meant she had something in mind. "Sit down, Sarah," her mother commanded in a tone that brooked no argument. Sarah, tired and worn out, dropped her bag onto the floor and pulled out a chair. She had learned long ago that arguing with her mother was pointless. "What is it now?" "Mom?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Cynthia looked at her, her eyes glinting with a mixture of expectation and frustration. "I've been thinking," she began, swirling the wine in her glass as if it were the most casual of conversations. "You've been talking about that fancy mansion and Grandma Helen's grandson. Well, I have an idea." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Cynthia had always seen people in terms of what they could offer her, never truly caring about their emotions or personal lives, only their status. "I think you should marry someone like Mr. Davis. You know, the wealthy businessman from across town." Cynthia continued as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. Sarah stared at her mother in disbelief. "What? Marry Mr. Davis?" She repeated, her voice shaky with shock. "Why would I marry him?" Cynthia's lips curled into a thin smile. "Because he can take care of you, Sarah, and he can take care of Andrew's mess. We need him, and you know it. Your brother's debts aren't going to disappear on their own." Sarah felt her chest tighten as she listened to her mother's words. It wasn't the first time her mother had suggested that she marry someone for security, but this time felt different. This time it was about more than just a potential husband. It was about securing a future for Andrew, one that Sarah had to carry on her shoulders. The weight of her mother's expectations settled heavily on Sarah's chest. It felt like the walls were closing in around her, suffocating her with the pressure to comply. "Mum, I'm not marrying Mr. Davis," Sarah said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm not going to marry anyone just to fix Andrew's mistakes. He has to take responsibility for his own actions." Cynthia's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "You're being selfish, Sarah. Your brother is in trouble. He's the only family you have left, and you should be doing everything you can to help him. Why can't you just do this one thing for us?" Sarah's heart pounded as she stood up, her frustration boiling over. "I've been doing everything for you, for both of you, for years," she said, her voice rising. "I've sacrificed my own life for you and Andrew, and I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not going to marry someone just to clean up Andrew's mess. I've had enough of being used." Cynthia's face flushed with anger, her voice rising to match Sarah's. "You think I'm using you? You think this is easy for me, Sarah?" she snapped. "You think I want to beg Mr. Davis for his help? He's willing to clear Andrew's debts, but you're too proud to accept it." Sarah's hands shook with rage, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm not proud, Mum," she said quietly. "I'm tired. I'm tired of living in a life that's not mine. I don't want to be stuck in this cycle anymore." There was a long silence between them, a silence that felt thick with years of unspoken resentment and expectations. Finally, Cynthia spoke, her voice cold and filled with a finality that made Sarah's stomach drop. "Fine," she said, her eyes narrow with frustration. "Do whatever you want, but remember, you're the one who will have to live with the consequences of your decisions." As Sarah left the room, she felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. She wasn't free from her family's expectations, not by a long shot. The pressure to fulfill her mother's demands weighed heavily on her shoulders, and though she had refused to marry Mr. Davis, she knew that the path ahead would still be filled with hardship. She couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a situation she hadn't chosen, where her family's problems were her responsibility, whether she liked it or not. That night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the city lights in the distance. She had hoped that one day she would escape, but it seemed as though the world was determined to keep her in this cycle of guilt, responsibility, and unfulfilled expectations. She wanted to break free to live for herself, but the weight of her family's struggles made it feel impossible. Sarah knew deep down that she couldn't let herself be used any longer, but she also didn't know how to escape the prison she had built around herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of determination rise within her. She wasn't going to let this life define her. She would find a way out, even if it meant standing up to everything she had known. The days that followed her argument with her mother were some of the hardest Sarah had ever faced. Each day felt heavier than the last as the weight of her family's expectations pressed down on her chest. The guilt, the pressure to fix Andrew's mess, and the overwhelming feeling that she was being used by everyone around her left her feeling suffocated. She had spent so many years trying to make things work, trying to meet her mother's demands and doing everything she could to hold her family together, but it was never enough. No matter how hard she tried, it seemed like the more she gave, the more they took, until there was nothing left of her. One evening, after yet another long day of cleaning up after Andrew's mistakes and enduring her mother's harsh words, Sarah sat in her room, staring blankly at the walls. Her head was spinning, and her heart felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of everything. She had given so much, sacrificed so much, and yet her mother still expected more. And Andrew, he never changed. He continued to waste money on gambling, never taking responsibility for his actions, leaving Sarah to pick up the pieces she had had enough. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't continue sacrificing her own happiness and future for people who didn't appreciate her. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, she realized that she couldn't stay another day in that house. The thought of leaving both terrified and exhilarated her. But what choice did she have? She had always been the one to hold everything together, but now she was falling apart. The thought of finding a way out, a place where she could breathe, where she could be herself, and not just the caretaker, was the only thing that gave her a sliver of hope. Sarah knew that she needed to leave. She needed to find somewhere, anywhere, away from the suffocating grip of her family, where she could start fresh. Without a second thought, Sarah packed a bag that night. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, or why. She couldn't bear to hear her mother's objections, couldn't stand the guilt that would inevitably follow. The next morning, before anyone had woken up, Sarah slipped out of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked through the quiet streets, her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. After what felt like an eternity of walking, Sarah arrived at Grandma Helen's mansion, the place that had always felt like a safe haven in the midst of her chaos. Grandma Helen greeted Sarah at the door with the same warmth and kindness that Sarah had grown to cherish. "My dear, what brings you here today?" Grandma Helen asked, concern in her eyes. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she stepped inside the weight of the decision she had made. Sinking in, "I needed to get away," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "I couldn't stay there anymore. It's too much. I feel like I'm drowning." Grandma Helen's face softened, and she led Sarah into the sitting room, where they both sat down in the cozy chairs by the fireplace. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room for a moment as Grandma Helen reached out and gently took Sarah's hand. "Sweetheart," Grandma Helen said softly, her voice soothing. "I can see how hard you've been trying. You've carried the weight of so much for so long, but you don't have to do it alone. Things will get better. I promise." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears as she listened to Grandma Helen's comforting words. It was the first time in a long while that she had felt understood, that she had felt like someone saw her pain and cared enough to offer reassurance. Grandma Helen's presence was a balm to her soul, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe this could be the fresh start she had been craving. As they talked, Grandma Helen insisted on offering Sarah financial support to help her get back on her feet. "I know you've been through so much," Grandma Helen said gently. "If you need anything, I want you to know I'm here for you. You don't have to do this alone. I can help you. Get back on your feet." Sarah looked at Grandma Helen, her heart swelling with gratitude. It was an offer that many would have accepted without hesitation. But for Sarah, it felt like another form of being tethered, another way of being dependent on someone else. She had spent so many years living for others, sacrificing her own happiness and desires to meet the needs of her family. She didn't want to rely on anyone else anymore, not even Grandma Helen, who had been nothing but kind to her. "I appreciate it," Grandma Sarah said, her voice steady but firm, "but I can't take your money. I need to do this on my own. I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own 2 feet." Grandma Helen looked at her with a mixture of understanding and concern. "I know, my dear," she said, her voice soft, "but sometimes it's okay to accept help. You don't have to do everything alone, but I respect your decision and I'm here for you." "No matter what," Sarah smiled gratefully, though a part of her felt guilty for turning down the offer. She had always been fiercely independent, but the thought of starting over on her own, without the safety net of family or financial support, was daunting. Still, she knew it was the right decision for her. She couldn't rely on others to fix her life anymore. She had to take control of her own future, even if it meant starting from scratch. That evening, as Sarah sat with Grandma Helen, feeling the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being in a place that felt like home, she realized something for the first time in years. She felt like she had a chance to live for herself. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore, and she didn't have to live under the weight of her family's expectations. She had made a difficult decision to leave, and while it was scary, it also felt like the beginning of something new. As she drifted off to sleep that night in the guest room of Grandma Helen's mansion, Sarah closed her eyes with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what others expected of her. She was thinking about her own future, her own happiness, and the possibility of a new beginning. The days following Sarah's arrival at Grandma Helen's mansion were filled with a strange mix of peace and unease. Sarah had spent years in a constant state of tension, always striving to meet her family's expectations, and now, in the comfort of Grandma Helen's home, she was beginning to feel a sense of calm she hadn't known in a long time. Her decision to leave her mother's house had not been easy, but it had been necessary. Now, as she spent more time with Grandma Helen, Sarah found herself starting to breathe easier. She even began to look forward to the occasional visits from Jack, Grandma Helen's grandson, though he remained distant and reserved. Jack's visits to the mansion were always brief and businesslike. He seemed more like a man on a mission than someone who could take time to connect with others. Despite Grandma Helen's best efforts to draw him into conversation, Jack's mind was always elsewhere, on work, on responsibilities, on anything but the world around him. Sarah couldn't help but notice the way he seemed weighed down by invisible burdens, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. And yet there was something about him that intrigued her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He had a magnetism about him, a presence that was undeniable, even if he didn't make an effort to engage with the world. One evening, as Sarah sat in the grand living room reading a book by the fireplace, she heard the familiar sound of the door opening. Jack had arrived. As usual, he was dressed in a dark suit, his face set in the same determined expression she had grown used to. He greeted Grandma Helen briefly, and then, as though on cue, his eyes met Sarah's across the room. There was no warmth in his gaze, just a flicker of acknowledgement. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." His tone wasn't unkind, but it was direct, businesslike. Grandma Helen, sensing the seriousness of the moment, gave them both a small knowing smile before excusing herself from the room. The room felt suddenly smaller as Jack sat across from Sarah, his eyes focused on something beyond her, as if he was trying to find the right words. Sarah's heart began to race, wondering what this conversation was about. "Jack, what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Jack took a deep breath and looked at her, his eyes finally meeting hers with a rare intensity. "I've been thinking about the situation," he began, his words measured, calculated. "About the business side of things, about what Grandma Helen has been saying." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" she asked, unsure of where this was leading. Jack paused for a moment before continuing, his voice steady but lacking warmth. I'm in a position where I need to make a strategic move, both for my personal life and for the company. The board has been pressuring me to stabilize my image to show that I'm serious about the future of the company. They want to see stability in my personal life as well, and that means I need to get married. Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding as she processed his words. Jack was talking about marriage, but there was no mention of love, no indication that this was anything more than a business arrangement. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "You want us to get married?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he said simply. "It would be a marriage of convenience, a way to secure my future, both personally and professionally. It's not about love." "Sarah, it's about practicality, about meeting the expectations of the company and the public, and I think you're the right person for this." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected that Jack was not interested in love, but to hear him speak so plainly about it left her feeling hollow. He didn't want her for who she was. He wanted her for what she represented. Despite the coldness of his words, Sarah couldn't deny the practicality of his proposal. She had seen how much pressure Jack was under, how much he carried on his shoulders. He was a man who was used to making decisions for the good of the company, for the good of his family, and this was no different. But still, the thought of marrying someone without love, without the promise of a future together, stung. She had dreamed of love, of connection, but she knew that in this moment, love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Jack looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a sign of agreement. "I know this isn't ideal," he said, his voice softer now, "but I think it's the best solution for both of us. I can offer you security, and you can help me maintain the image I need to keep the company stable. We can both move forward without the complications that come with searching for something more. It's the smart choice." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent so long hoping for something real, something deep, but here was Jack offering her a chance to escape the chaos of her own life in exchange for a marriage that would be nothing more than a contract. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but maybe it was what she needed. After a long silence, Sarah took a deep breath. She thought about her past, her family, the years she had spent trying to please her mother and fix Andrew's mistakes. She thought about her future, about the possibility of a fresh start of stability. And in that moment, Sarah realized that this was her way out. It wasn't ideal, but it was practical, and sometimes practicality was all you had. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll marry you, Jack." Jack's expression softened slightly, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere but reserved. "I know this isn't easy, but I believe it's the right decision." Sarah nodded, though a part of her felt like she was sealing a chapter of her life that she hadn't quite finished writing. This wasn't the love story she had hoped for, but it was a story of survival, of moving forward despite the odds. As the conversation ended, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt relief. This was a decision that would give her the stability she had been craving. But another part of her, a part she tried to push away, felt sadness. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a life she could live. As she left the room, Sarah felt a weight on her chest, but she knew that for better or for worse, she had made the choice. Jack's proposal was a practical one, and in the world they both inhabited, practicality often outweighed the dreams of the heart. The days following Sarah's agreement to marry Jack felt like a blur. The proposal had come with a sense of finality, like a decision made out of necessity rather than choice. The cold, businesslike nature of their arrangement settled in as the days passed, and Sarah soon realized that this marriage was in every sense a contractual obligation. There was no romance, no passion, just a quiet understanding that they were both fulfilling a role. Jack, as expected, remained distant. His focus was always on his work, his responsibilities, and his position in the company. There was no hint of affection, no warmth in his words or actions toward her. It was as though she were just another part of his life that needed to be managed, no different from a business meeting or a conference call. Sarah quickly adapted to the coldness of their relationship. They lived under the same roof, but were like strangers occupying the same space without ever truly engaging with each other. Jack's days were consumed with meetings, business decisions, and the constant pressures of running the company. He rarely spoke to her unless absolutely necessary, and even then their conversations were curt and impersonal. Sarah, too, kept her distance, refusing to rely on Jack's wealth or status. She knew that this arrangement was for security, not for companionship, and she was determined to prove to herself that she could stand on her own. Despite living in a mansion, she kept her life as simple as possible, working hard each day, staying focused on her goals, and continuing to build a career outside of her marriage. Jack didn't seem to care one way or the other. He was indifferent to Sarah's presence, lost in the world of his own responsibilities. They would share meals in silence, passing each other like two ships in the night. There were no late-night conversations, no shared laughter, no moments of intimacy. It was clear that this was a partnership built on convenience, not connection. Sarah's role was simple: to fulfill the social expectations of being Jack's wife, while he maintained his image as the successful, powerful CEO. It was an arrangement that suited him, and for the most part it suited Sarah as well. She didn't want anything from him except the stability that came with the marriage, and she wasn't interested in complicating matters with emotions or expectations. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift. Albeit slowly, Jack, for all his focus on work, started to notice Sarah. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic, but he couldn't help but observe her. At first, it was her unwavering dedication. Sarah had thrown herself into her work with a level of commitment that impressed even Jack. Despite his initial indifference, she refused to take the easy route, choosing to work hard and maintain her independence. She wasn't interested in being pampered or relying on Jack's wealth to make her life easier. It was something Jack admired, even if he wouldn't admit it. He'd always prided himself on his own work ethic, and to see Sarah mirror that determination made him respect her in a way he hadn't expected. Jack began to notice the small things: how Sarah would wake up early every day, how she tackled her work with focus and precision, how she didn't shy away from responsibility. She wasn't the kind of woman who sat idly by, waiting for life to hand her things. She worked for everything she had, and Jack couldn't help but respect that. There was something refreshing about her drive, something that made her stand out from everyone else he knew. At the office, Sarah was a force to be reckoned with, sharp professional and always striving for excellence. She didn't need Jack's attention or approval, and that in itself was something Jack found compelling. As time went on, Jack began to watch Sarah more closely, even when he didn't mean to. He'd find himself wondering how she spent her days when he wasn't around, how she managed to stay so focused and composed, despite the cold, impersonal nature of their marriage. He started noticing the way she handled herself with such grace and strength. He admired the way she navigated the world without relying on anyone, least of all him. There was a quiet strength in Sarah that he hadn't fully appreciated before. It wasn't just her work ethic, it was her resilience, her ability to maintain her sense of self despite everything that had happened in her life. She was strong, capable, and independent, and for the first time in a long time, Jack found himself intrigued by her in a way that went beyond their arrangement. Despite this growing admiration, Jack remained distant. He was still trapped in his own world, focused on his career and the image he had worked so hard to build. But Sarah's presence, her dedication, and her quiet strength slowly began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. It wasn't love, not yet, but something was changing. Jack couldn't deny that he was drawn to Sarah in a way that he hadn't been before. It was an uncomfortable feeling, one that he didn't know how to process. He wasn't ready to open up to her. He wasn't even sure he could. But as the days passed, he began to realize that their cold marriage might not be as simple as he had thought. Sarah, for her part, remained focused on her own path. She knew that she couldn't rely on Jack for anything beyond what was already in place. She refused to be dependent on him to let their marriage define her worth. She continued to work hard to build her career and to maintain her independence. She wasn't looking for Jack's approval, and she certainly wasn't waiting for him to love her. But she couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in him, the way he began to look at her differently. It was small, almost imperceptible. But Sarah began to feel a sense of change in the air, something that hadn't been there before. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time she allowed herself to hope that there could be more to this cold marriage than she had originally believed. The news came unexpectedly, like a storm that no one saw coming. Jack was sitting in his office, buried in paperwork as he usually was. The constant demands of the company, the expectations placed on him as CEO, had kept him distracted, and he hadn't been paying much attention to the news or anything beyond his immediate responsibilities. But then his phone rang, and everything changed. It was an official call from a private investigator, a breakthrough in the case he had been obsessively working on for years. The voice on the other end was calm, but the words sent a shockwave through Jack's body. "We've found her. Mr. Thompson. Emily Williams is alive. She's been found." Jack's heart skipped a beat as he processed the words. Emily. The woman he had thought lost forever, the woman he had spent years searching for, was alive. He could hardly believe it. After 15 long years of dead ends, of fruitless searches, of holding on to the hope that one day she would return, Emily was finally found. Jack's mind raced images of their past, together flooding his thoughts. The memories of their youth, the love they shared, and the promise he made to her that he would never stop looking. He had always believed in his heart that she would come back, that fate would bring her home to him. Jack's emotions were a whirlwind of excitement, disbelief, and overwhelming joy. He immediately made arrangements to meet with the investigator to see proof of Emily's return with his own eyes. His thoughts raced ahead, imagining the reunion, the life they would rebuild together. But in the back of his mind, a quiet thought lingered: his marriage to Sarah. Their marriage had always been practical, a way to satisfy both his personal and professional needs. It had been an arrangement, not a love story, but still the thought of Emily's return marked the end of the life he had been living with Sarah. His heart was set on Emily. He had never stopped loving her, and now, with her back in his life, everything else would fall into place. When Jack returned home that evening, he found Sarah sitting in the living room, her face drawn with the exhaustion that had become all too familiar over the past months. She looked up at him as he entered, sensing something was different in the air. Jack couldn't hide the joy on his face. His heart was still racing from the news. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I've received news today. It's about Emily." The mention of Emily's name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her heart tightened, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. She knew she had known deep down that this day would come. Jack continued, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "She's been found. After all these years, she's alive, and I need to be with her. I've been waiting for this moment my entire life. Sarah, I have to go to her." The words stung, but they weren't a surprise. Sarah had always known that Jack's heart belonged to someone else. It was the unspoken truth that lingered between them, the reason their marriage had been so cold, so distant. It wasn't that Jack had never cared for her, but Sarah had always known she wasn't the one Jack truly loved. She was just the one he had settled for, the one who had been there when he needed someone to fulfill a role. Sarah felt a sharp ache in her chest as she looked at Jack. Her mind was a swirl of emotions, hurt, sorrow, but also a sense of relief. She had known all along that their marriage was a temporary solution, a way to stabilize his image, to satisfy the business world's expectations. She had never truly believed in the idea of love between them. She had accepted the arrangement because it was all she could do. But now, as Jack stood before her, ready to leave her for the woman he had never stopped searching for, it became clear she had never been more than a placeholder. "I understand," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of his words, but she had made peace with the reality of their marriage long ago. "You've been waiting for this moment for years. Jack, I knew this day would come." She stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She wanted to cry, to scream, but she had no energy left. She had given everything she had to this marriage, and now she was left with nothing but the cold truth. Jack's eyes softened, but only for a moment. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but Sarah stepped back, holding up her hand. "No, Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I'm not angry. I knew I was never the one for you. I just thought I could make a life here, but I see now that it's not my life to have Jack's face tightened with regret." But he didn't argue. There was nothing more to say. His heart was already with Emily, and no matter how much he cared for Sarah, his future was with her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but distant. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I have to do this. Emily's return changes everything." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I know," she whispered, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "I know." She felt her chest tighten, a flood of emotions rushing through her. But despite the pain, there was a strange sense of peace that settled over her. She had never truly belonged in this life, and now she was free, free to find her own path, to finally live a life that was her own. As Jack turned to leave the room, Sarah stood there, her heart heavy but resigned. She knew the marriage was over, and she had made her peace with it. Jack was not hers to keep, and she had never truly been his to love. She watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and for the first time she felt a deep sense of finality. She was alone, but she was also free. Free from the chains of a marriage that had never been her own, free to start again, even if it meant walking away from everything she had known. The following days were a blur. Jack's focus was entirely on Emily's return, on reconnecting with the woman he had loved all those years ago. He spent his days meeting with her, sorting out the details of her return and planning their future together. Sarah, on the other hand, quietly began to rebuild her own life. She had known from the beginning that their marriage was never going to last, but the pain of seeing it come to an end was still overwhelming. She knew it was time to move on, to find herself again, to step out of the shadows of Jack and his world, and into her own. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel like she was living for someone else. She was living for herself, and that for now was enough. Jack had waited for this moment for so long that he almost couldn't believe it was finally happening. After 15 years of searching, of hoping, and of clinging to the memories of a woman he had loved as a child, Emily Williams was back. When the news came that she had been found, Jack couldn't contain his excitement. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. For years he had believed that Emily had been taken from him by fate, but now, with her return, everything was supposed to fall into place. The pain of losing her, of searching fruitlessly, was supposed to be over. But as Jack spent more time with Emily, something didn't sit right with him. She wasn't the same woman he remembered. Emily had changed, and Jack noticed it almost immediately. Her appearance had altered. Of course, she had grown into a woman with sharp features, an air of sophistication, and an almost aloof demeanor. But it was more than that. The woman standing before him, claiming to be the Emily he had once known, seemed distant, cold, and calculated. She was polite, yes, but there was a subtle sharpness in her interactions, a disconnect that Jack couldn't ignore. The warmth, the selflessness, the kindness that he had once adored about her, it was gone. In its place was someone who seemed more concerned with appearances, with the wealth and status of the Williams family, than with reconnecting with the people who had cared for her. At first, Jack chalked it up to the trauma she must have experienced during the years they were apart. She had been in an orphanage after all. Perhaps the time away had changed her in ways he couldn't understand. But as the days passed, he began to notice more and more behaviors that didn't add up. Emily was far too comfortable with the luxuries of the Williams family, as if she had been raised in them all along. She wasn't interested in discussing the past, in the people who had cared for her, or in the life they had once shared. Instead, she focused on what she could gain, how she could secure her place in the family's estate, in their wealth, and in their power. The more Jack thought about it, the more uncomfortable he felt. Something about Emily's return felt off. It wasn't until Jack did some digging of his own, reaching out to the private investigator who had helped locate Emily, that the truth began to surface. The investigator had uncovered some disturbing details about the woman who claimed to be Emily Williams. After reviewing the records, Jack learned that Emily's return wasn't a simple reunion. It was a calculated move. She had manipulated the situation, using her knowledge of the Williams family's vulnerabilities to position herself as the rightful heir to the family fortune. Emily had orchestrated her return in a way that left everyone blind to her true intentions. She hadn't been the lost, innocent woman Jack had imagined. She had been playing a long game, biding her time until she could claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Jack felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed himself to believe in the fairy tale of Emily's return, when all along she had been deceiving him, deceiving everyone? The truth stung, and it cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. He couldn't let this lie go on any longer. Emily had to be confronted, and the truth had to come to light. Jack arranged to meet her privately away from the prying eyes of the Williams family, where he could expose the lies and unmask her as the fraud she truly was. The confrontation was tense. Jack met Emily in one of the grand sitting rooms of the Williams estate, the same room where they had first reunited. The space, once filled with hope and warmth, now felt cold and oppressive. Emily stood by the window looking out at the sprawling grounds as if she hadn't a care in the world. When she turned to face Jack, there was a faint smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Jack's expression was stone cold. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp with anger. Emily raised an eyebrow, but she didn't seem concerned about what she asked casually, her tone betraying no emotion. "You've been lying to me," Jack said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and betrayal. "You've been using my family, using me to secure your place in this family. You're not the woman I remember, Emily. You've changed into someone I don't even recognize." Emily's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but she quickly masked the reaction with a smile. "What are you talking about, Jack?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time. I've been through a lot, and I'm just trying to fit back into the life I left behind." Jack stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "No, Emily, you're not here because you want to be part of our family. You're here for the inheritance, for the money and the power. You've been planning this from the moment you showed up." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I've had investigators look into your past. You've manipulated this whole situation to get what you want. You're not the real Emily Williams. You're a fraud." The color drained from Emily's face for the briefest moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're wrong, Jack," she said, her voice cool and distant. "I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I'm here for a fresh start. I've earned this, and if you don't believe me, that's your problem." Jack's anger flared, and he stepped closer to her, his voice low and dangerous. "No, Emily. The problem is that you've deceived everyone. You've used my family's vulnerability to manipulate your way into this life, and I'm not going to stand by and let you take what doesn't belong to you." Emily's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You'll never understand, will you, Jack?" she said, her voice cold and bitter. "This is about survival. This is about what I deserve." Jack shook his head, his disappointment clear. "You'll never deserve this family, Emily. Not with the lies you've built your life on." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the room, her face twisted with anger and resentment. As he left, Jack felt a sense of finality wash over him. Emily's return had been a lie from the start, and he had been blind to it. But now that the truth was out, he knew he couldn't let her continue deceiving everyone. The woman he had loved as a child was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating imposter. As Jack left the estate, he felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. Emily had been exposed, and now the family could begin to heal from the damage she had caused. But even as he walked away from the confrontation, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He had spent so many years searching for her, holding on to a memory that had never been real. Now he was free from the past, but he was also left wondering what could have been. What if he had seen the signs sooner? What if he had let go of Emily before she had caused all this damage? The answers would never come, but Jack knew one thing for sure. The truth was out, and he could finally move on. The days after the confrontation with Emily were the hardest Jack had ever faced. He had spent so many years searching for the woman he thought he had loved, only to realize that his memories of her had been tainted by time and false hope. He had finally confronted her, only to discover that the woman standing before him was nothing like the Emily he had once known. She was a stranger, a manipulator, and the weight of the truth hit him like a tidal wave. Jack was left reeling from the discovery, and the person he had come to rely on through it all, the person who had stood by him during his darkest days, was Sarah. But by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. Sarah had already left. He tried calling her, searching for her wherever he could, but she was nowhere to be found. He had thought that their marriage, though cold and impersonal, had at least been a safe harbor, a temporary arrangement that allowed both of them to fulfill their respective roles. But Sarah had never truly been content with that life. Jack had never understood how much she had sacrificed, how much she had quietly endured while he focused on his own struggles. When Emily returned, Jack thought he was reclaiming the past, but he had pushed Sarah aside in the process. Now he was paying the price Sarah had left with no fanfare, no dramatic goodbye. She had simply packed a few belongings left behind the life she had built with Jack and walked away. Her heart was heavy with the decision, but deep down she knew it was the right one. The moment Jack had turned back to Emily, Sarah had known that their marriage, their arrangement, had come to an end. It was never meant to last. It had been a business transaction, not a relationship built on love, and she couldn't remain in a life where she was just a placeholder. She needed to find her own path, one that was free from the weight of Jack's world, his expectations, and his wealth. After leaving the mansion, Sarah found a small apartment in a quiet part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was hers. There were no grand luxuries, no sprawling gardens or ornate furniture. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt free. She could breathe in a way she hadn't been able to in years. The apartment was modest, but it was her sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild her life from scratch. She didn't need Jack's wealth, didn't need the comforts he could offer. All she needed was a fresh start. She found a new job at a small marketing firm, a job that paid the bills but also gave her a sense of purpose. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but Sarah didn't care. She was no longer living for anyone else. She was living for herself, and that was enough. She threw herself into her work, learning the ropes of her new role, meeting new people, and slowly finding her confidence again. Each day was a challenge, but with every challenge she grew stronger. She had always known she was capable of more, and now she was proving it to herself. Jack tried reaching out to her, but Sarah remained silent. She had made her decision, and it wasn't just about walking away from him. It was about walking away from the life she had allowed herself to become trapped in. She had spent so many years trying to meet the expectations of others, her mother, Jack, even society, and in the process she had lost sight of who she truly was. Now, in her tiny apartment, she was rediscovering herself piece by piece. She was learning to trust her own instincts, to trust that she could make it on her own without relying on anyone else. Especially not Jack. The first few months were the hardest. There were nights when Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice. She missed the life she had once had, the luxury, the stability. But deep down she knew that it wasn't a life that had ever truly been hers. She couldn't continue living in a world that wasn't her own. She had to carve her own path, even if it meant walking away from the only world she had known for so long. In time, Sarah grew stronger, more confident in her independence. She made new friends at her job, began to enjoy the simple pleasures in life, things she had once overlooked. She spent her weekends exploring the city, finding hidden cafes and learning new hobbies. Every day was an opportunity to rediscover herself, to learn what made her happy outside of Jack's world. She didn't need his approval anymore, didn't need his wealth or status. She had everything she needed right within herself. As the months went by, Sarah found a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She wasn't waiting for Jack to come back into her life, and she wasn't looking for validation from anyone. She was living for herself, something she hadn't truly done in years. And while she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer trapped. She was free. The woman who had once been defined by her relationships, by what others expected of her, had found her own voice, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away from her again. The weeks following Sarah's breakaway had been full of new beginnings, new opportunities, and a sense of independence she had never known before. She was slowly but surely putting her life back together, taking control of her own destiny, away from the pressures and manipulations of her family. But just as she was starting to believe that she could build a life of peace and stability, her past came crashing back into her world. It started with a call from her mother, Cynthia, the same voice that had been a constant source of frustration, guilt, and manipulation throughout Sarah's life. "Sarah," Cynthia's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and demanding. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach at the mere sound of her mother's voice. She had avoided contact for months, knowing that anything related to her mother meant trouble. But feeling a mixture of duty and anxiety, she reluctantly agreed to meet. The conversation began innocuously enough, but the undercurrent of manipulation was undeniable. Cynthia, ever the master of guilt, quickly moved to her usual tactic, guilt-tripping Sarah for her independence. "You've made your choice to live on your own, but your brother Andrew still needs help. I've been talking to Mr. Davis. You know he could help fix everything, Andrew's debts, our problems, everything. You need to marry him. Sarah, it's the only solution." Her mother insisted. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she realized where this conversation was heading. "No, Mom," she said firmly, her voice trembling with frustration. "I'm not marrying anyone just to fix Andrew's mess. You have to stop using me as a tool for your own convenience." Cynthia's tone grew colder, sharper. "You've got it all wrong, Sarah. This isn't just about Andrew. It's about securing your future. Our future. Mr. Davis is a wealthy man, and he's been after you for months. You can't afford to turn him down." Sarah's mind raced. Her mother's persistence was a force she couldn't easily escape, but this time she was prepared. She wasn't the same vulnerable young woman she had once been. "I'm not doing this anymore. I won't let you push me into a marriage I don't want." Sarah replied, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and resolve. But even as Sarah spoke, she knew this wasn't the end of it. She knew her mother wasn't the type to accept rejection quietly, and she feared that Cynthia would do anything to make this happen. And it wasn't just Cynthia she had to worry about. Emily, the woman Jack had once searched for and thought he had loved, had slowly but surely wormed her way into the Williams family and into Sarah's life once more. Emily, with her cold, calculating eyes, had made it clear that she wasn't finished. Yet Emily had always seen Sarah as an obstacle to be removed, and now, with Sarah living on her own, she was working with Cynthia to force her into a marriage with Mr. Davis. As Sarah returned home from her meeting with her mother, her heart pounded in her chest. She had hoped that by walking away from Jack, she would be free from the tangled mess of her past. But it seemed like the web of manipulation her mother had woven around her was far from untangled. Before she could even begin to process what had just happened, her phone rang again. It was a call from Jack. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether she was ready to talk to him again after everything that had happened between them, but something told her she needed to pick up Sarah. Jack's voice came through the phone, urgent and filled with concern. "Where are you? Your mother has been working with Emily. They're trying to force you into a marriage with Mr. Davis." Sarah's heart sank as she listened to Jack's words. He had found out everything. The realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just a conversation with her mother about expectations anymore. This was manipulation on a whole new level. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know what to do anymore. They're trying to control me, to make me do something I don't want. I feel like I have no choice." Jack's voice softened, filled with a protective fierceness. "Sarah, listen to me. You have a choice. You always have. And I'm not going to let them control you. I'm coming to you now." Sarah's mind was racing as she struggled to find the words. Her heart was torn between her desire for independence and the lingering feelings she had for Jack, even though their marriage had always been an arrangement, a cold and distant one. She hadn't realized just how much she missed him until now. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on him, even in the midst of everything. But it was too late. She had to stand on her own. Now, before Sarah could respond, the doorbell rang. A chill ran down her spine, and she instinctively knew that her mother and Emily had come to confront her again. As she opened the door, she was met with the sight of Jack standing in the doorway, his eyes burning with determination. Without a word, he stepped inside, his presence filling the room with a sense of urgency. "I'm not letting them do this to you," Jack said firmly, his voice full of conviction. "We're going to stop this now." The confrontation that followed was swift and fierce. Jack stood between Sarah and the two women who had been trying to manipulate her, his anger and frustration palpable. "Enough, Cynthia," Jack said, his voice cold and commanding. "This ends here. Sarah is not your pawn, and neither is she Emily's. You can't control her anymore." Emily's face twisted in disbelief, but Jack was unyielding. "You've both been using Sarah for your own agendas, and I won't stand for it. You've been deceiving her, making her think she had no other options, but Sarah is strong. She's not the person you think she is." Sarah stood silently, her heart swelling with gratitude and a sense of relief as Jack's words cut through the tension in the room. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in so long, she felt like she was no longer trapped in the web of manipulation. Jack had come to her rescue, not out of obligation, but out of love and respect for her. She had spent so long trying to please others, trying to meet their expectations, but Jack had just given her the freedom she had always wanted. He had shown her that she could fight for herself and that she didn't have to do it alone. As the confrontation ended, Jack turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "You're safe now, Sarah. I'll make sure of it," he said. His voice filled with an unwavering promise. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she met Jack's gaze. Despite everything that had happened between them, there was a sense of peace in this moment. Jack was no longer the man he once was, and neither was she. They had both changed, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could rebuild what had been broken. They could move forward together, this time on their own terms. The days after the final confrontation had been a whirlwind of emotions for Jack. It was as if everything had come to a head in that moment, when he had stood in front of Sarah, confronting the people who had tried to control her life, and realizing just how much he had been blind to his own feelings. He had spent so much time focused on Emily, on the past, that he had failed to see the woman standing right in front of him, the one who had been there all along, offering him her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering support. The cold, businesslike arrangement they had once shared had evolved into something he couldn't ignore anymore. Jack had been running from the truth, but now, in the silence of his own thoughts, he could no longer deny it. He had fallen in love with Sarah. It was a realization that shook him to his core. He had spent so much time building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of losing Emily and holding on to the belief that she would return. But in doing so, he had neglected the one person who had truly cared for him, the one person who had never asked for anything in return. Sarah had been there for him in ways he never expected, standing by him when he was focused on his work, offering support when he needed it, and giving him the space to be himself without judgment. Her strength, her resilience, her willingness to fight for her own happiness, everything about Sarah had captivated him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth settled in his heart, like a weight he couldn't shake off. Jack had never been one for grand declarations, for showing vulnerability, but now he knew that he had to do something he had never done before. He had to face Sarah and admit the truth to her and to himself. He couldn't let this chance slip away, not after everything they had been through. Jack had spent so much of his life chasing after something that didn't exist, but now he realized that what he had been looking for was right in front of him all along. The next day, Jack arranged a meeting with Sarah. He couldn't wait any longer, couldn't hide his feelings anymore. The moment he saw her walking toward him, her head held high, her confidence radiating from her, he knew he had to tell her Sarah. He said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I need to tell you something. I've been running from this for so long, but I can't ignore it anymore. I've fallen in love with you." Sarah froze, her eyes widening in surprise as she processed his words. For a moment there was silence between them, the weight of what Jack had said hanging in the air. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She simply stood there, taking in what he had just confessed. Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes, and for a moment he wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then Sarah's expression softened, and she stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "Jack," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought I would hear you say that. After everything that's happened between us, I never thought we would get to this point." Jack reached out, taking her hands in his voice filled with both hope and regret. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know I haven't been the man you deserved," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "But I can't change the past. All I can do is be honest with you now and tell you that I want a future with you. You're the one I want, Sarah. I don't want to hide from this anymore." Sarah's heart was racing, and a part of her wanted to pull away to protect herself from getting hurt again. But there was something in Jack's eyes, something she had never seen before, something real. She had always known that Jack was a good man beneath the surface, and now, for the first time, she saw the depth of his feelings for her. The moment between them felt electric, charged with the weight of everything they had been through. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. She had always been the one to carry the weight of her decisions, to make sure she never relied on anyone else, but in this moment she realized that maybe it was okay to let someone in. Maybe it was okay to let Jack in. She had fought so hard to protect herself, to stay independent, but now she saw that love wasn't about giving up who you were. It was about finding someone who would support and care for you without trying to change you. Jack wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but together they could build something real. "I love you too," Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "I've been afraid of getting hurt, but I can't deny how I feel anymore. We've both been through so much, and maybe we haven't always gotten it right, but I believe we can build something together." Jack's heart soared at her words, and he pulled her into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her tightly. For the first time in so long, he felt like everything was right in the world. They were both finally being honest with each other, and it felt like the beginning of something new. A few days later, Jack gathered their closest friends and family at the Williams estate for an event that was meant to be a celebration, but in reality it was so much more. As they stood in the grand hall with the soft hum of conversation filling the air, Jack turned to Sarah, his heart beating faster than ever. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've asked you to stand by me through everything, through the lies, the mistakes, and the heartbreak. But today I want to ask you something different." He dropped to one knee in front of her, the room falling silent as everyone watched. "Sarah, will you marry me? Not as a business arrangement, not because of any expectations, but because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked down at Jack, her heart swelling with love and joy. She had never imagined this moment would come, not after everything they had been through. But here they were, and everything felt right. "Yes, Jack," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." The room erupted into applause as Jack stood up, taking her hand and slipping a beautiful ring onto her finger. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, was now filled with possibility. Together they had overcome their past, and now they were ready to face the future with love, trust, and a commitment to each other that neither of them had ever thought possible. As they embraced, surrounded by the people they cared about, Sarah and Jack knew that they had come a long way. They had both been broken, but now they had rebuilt their relationship from the ground up. This was a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt like they were finally home. Together, thank you for following along with our journey at Deep Inside HQ. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Join our community and stay tuned as we continue to bring you powerful stories that explore the twists and turns of human emotions, relationships, and the struggles we all face. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. We love hearing your thoughts, so please leave a comment. Share your favorite moments and let's continue the conversation. Stay connected with us and let's dive even deeper into the stories that matter.